things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him. Yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and living of this holy word this day.
Thanks be to God.
You may be seated.
So these last 3 weeks that have passed, we've been talking about how the scriptures sing of Christmas. And we thought about how hard it would be to imagine Christmas without music. And we came to maybe an understanding that we'd already had, but made more clear that oftentimes, and this is the way I think of it, that Christmas and music are inseparable, no matter what kind of Christmas experience or that you might be familiar with. I've noticed at Christmas that even people who don't sing any other time sing at Christmas. And people that say they don't know any songs, they can sing all the verses of the Christmas carols. Because Christmas music just is a part of who we are, no matter what our religious upbringing. And we discovered the last few weeks that music has been a part of Christmas from the very first Christmas. And so we looked at the Song of Mary, the Magnificat. We looked how she sang of God's glory and grace, and also how she predicted the things that would come. And then we looked at the song of the angels out in the field to the lowly shepherds. And last week we talked about the song of an old man, Simeon. All of these happening to tell us about Christmas. So we thought about also the significance of those songs in our lives, and what those songs that were sung so long ago mean to us yet today. And so this week I'm going to share with you one last song, and this song is kind of, I'm going to call it a mystery song, because it's not a song that are words that we might associate with Christmas. These words that John wrote in his gospel are probably among the last to be written of the Gospels. And this song is not one that has been sung that I know of in any time, even in the early days. But when you read the words of John's Gospel, especially these first few verses, they have a rhythmic quality to them. And you can imagine, and maybe one of these days someone will be inspired to write great words. But I want, before we start any deeper into this moment, I want to read these parts of these words for you once again, because I want them to be in your mind as you hear what I have to share. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. There's a feeling of mystery in these words, don't you think? Sometimes I think we get so caught up in the word was and the word, this and that we get so confounded that we can't keep track of what it is we're trying to say. But I want you to remember these words, because they reach back into the places in our minds where we acknowledge that there's part of God that's unknown. There's a part of God that still is in territory that we might not get. It's the mystery of God. It is the place, though, where everything begins. So why would I call this a song of Christmas? Because it seems so far removed from all the other things that we've talked about, from the shepherds or from the manger. But the gospel writer, John, wanted everyone to know who read these words that this is where Christmas begins. It's not simply beginning with Joseph or Mary, but in the beginning, Christmas begins with God. And this is a fact of the Christmas story that I think sometimes we overlook and maybe we don't understand. Because Christmas begins with God, not with Bethlehem. Because the Christmas story is an eternal story. And if we forget that fact, then we let Christmas get lost in the busyness of the season, and we forget that Christmas was an act of God. And so when we read these, what seem like sometimes mysterious words in John's Gospel, it might not seem that, that we know what John is trying to get at. We might not, and I'm sure, at least I haven't in the past, associated those words with Christmas at all. But if we go back in time to when these words were written, those that heard them first probably would have understood them very clearly, because they studied and they understood about the word. This is part of Greek and Jewish history, historical teaching. They understood the concept of the word. Those faithful Jews who heard this would have hearkened back to perhaps the beginnings in Genesis, where the scripture tells us that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. They would have been reminded of those words because, again, drawing on that ancient story of creation, of God speaking the world into creation. And the ancient Greeks have a concept that was given to them by the philosopher Heraclitus in 560 BC. And then, from the historian Philo in the 1st century, they understood and taught about what this word was. And this would have been a commonplace study topic for the people at the time. And what he taught was that the word, or the reason, or the being of God was the oldest thing in the world. And that this word is the instrument that God used to make the world. And so when John's gospel was shared with those groups, the Jews and the Greeks, they understood what he was talking about. And then John adds a little bit. And John declares the word, or logos, the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so John is saying that in this mysterious divine being, in that moment in time, that divine mysterious being for a while walked as a human being on this earth. And that's what we mean by the word incarnation when we talk about it. The word incarnation literally means to put something into flesh. And so God incarnate is God being put into flesh. And the doctrine of the incarnation tells us that God came to us so that we would recognize a something because it looked like us. And when the gospel writer says the word became flesh, it's if he's trying not only to tell us that God wanted to communicate with us, but that God wanted to communicate with us so intensely that God decided the only way that we would be able to hear the word was to take on flesh and become a member of the human race. And so this gospel writer sings this magnificent news that the God who is from the beginning, who is the creator of the heaven and earth, has become flesh to dwell among us. So the Word walked our roads. The Word visited our villages, sweat in our marketplaces, and ate at our tables. The Word became flesh and lived among us. You see, these words demand more than just being spoken. I think they demand music. But when we read these words, music is probably not the first thing that jumps into your mind. Oh, that would be a snappy tune. But we should be thinking about all of the mystery and the harmony that comes into the world because of this great occurrence of the Word becoming flesh. There's a 20th century British artist and dramatist whose name is Lawrence Haussmann. And he wrote a story about St. Francis of Assisi. And the story is that St. Francis left a camp of Christians in order to go to a place where a sultan of the Saracens was going to try to convert this sultan to Christianity. And when he gets to where the sultan is, instead of being welcomed by the sultan, he's taken captive and made a prisoner. And when he's finally brought before the sultan, before this monarch in his tent, St. Francis has put together the following words in this story about the wonders of Christ in a way that he hopes will convince the Sultan to follow Christ. And so these are the words that he had St. Francis speak to the Sultan. Light looked down and beheld darkness. I will go there, said light. Peace looked down and beheld war. I will go there, said peace. Love looked down and beheld hatred. I will go there, said love. So came light and shone. So came peace and gave rest. So came love and brought life. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Great words that paint a picture for us of what it is to talk about God coming down and being made flesh. Because there are words that we understand there. We understand the words of light and love and peace. We get that. And there's something in us, deep within us, that resonates with those words of love and peace and light. But the hardest thing that we have to do as human beings is to live those concepts in our lives. And so for that we need guidance. And so the Word became flesh. But more than that, more than even the guidance of the words and of the Word becoming flesh, we need to, in some way, accept and have the power within us to take these qualities into our lives. And not just look at them as words, but look at them as qualities of life. So it's not enough that peace and love and light should become incarnate and walk among us. We too have to exercise those qualities in our own life. Some would say that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us are the most important words in the New Testament. And there's others that would say that these words are the New Testament, and that everything else in the New Testament is revolving around these words, and the Word became flesh. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm trying to minimize the Christmas story in Bethlehem and all of how that is a part of God's plan, because certainly that's an important part of the story. But what I want us to do is think seriously about the fact that the Christmas story does not begin in Bethlehem or in Nazareth, that it doesn't even begin with the angels or the visit to Mary or Joseph's dream, but that Christmas begins and began in the very heart of God and in God's desire to visit us for our salvation. So when God created humans, God placed in us a divine language of love and peace and goodness. But when we came to earth, we lost it. We forgot it. And so the language of love and peace and goodness is lost. And then a baby is born in Bethlehem. But much more happened to that Christmas than a baby being born. Oh, so much more. because of Jesus' birth, we were reminded of God's love for us. So as we begin to know love, as we begin to see love, as we begin to live out that love that is a part of God in us, it needs to be a possession that we hold tightly to. It needs to be a love that we live out in our lives every day. Because the scripture says that the Word became flesh. But more than that, it says that love came down at Christmas.